turned off.
All right. Well, in the vein of respecting everybody's time, we're going to get rolling. It has turned 12 o'clock. For those of you who don't know me, I am Stephanie Evans Kingsley. I'm the Executive Director of the Kentucky Workforce Innovation Board. We are very excited for this panel today. Part of what we are doing at the KWIB is really focusing on some new committee work. We have just recently established a diversity and inclusion in the workforce subcommittee that we are going to be leading from the executive committee until we can find a appropriate chair to lead us in that work and to really dig in and do some training for both our board as well as our network, and really looking to collaborate in all the ways that we can with our partners at the Kentucky Chamber. And with that, I will be happy to turn it over to Mr. Joe Frazier, who is the new executive director of the DEI Center at the Kentucky Chamber. Some of you may have heard him speak a couple weeks back at the Workforce Summit. Joe is a fantastic partner to the KWIB in his first 3 months here on the job, and we are really looking forward to finding other ways that we can partner with the Chamber to really have these important discussions. I think when we're looking at where we are in Kentucky with recovery from the pandemic, the accessibility, inclusivity, and all of the pieces that need to be front of mind when gaining traction for the workforce recovery. These conversations need to be happening now because there is no better time to invest in all walks of life in our workforce. So Joe, I am happy to turn it over to you to introduce the rest of the panel. And thank you all so much for joining us today.
Awesome, and thank you for that introduction. It's great to meet everyone. Again, I'm Joe Frazier, Executive Director for the Chamber's Center for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. And, you know, diversity, such a broad topic, and there's so many avenues of discussion where we can go, so many intricacies in the way we talk about diversity or equity with the different needs, right, of distinct populations that fall under that umbrella, especially when we think about historically underserved communities. So it's a pleasure to be here today again and to have our distinguished panelists who come from different communities and in a professional setting are working with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and being able to hear and learn more about them. So instead of necessarily going through each panelist's bio, because again, with everyone being so distinguished and we only have an hour today, what I'd like to do is go through our panelists one by one for you all to tell us about your current position and then also just your journey in getting to where you got to now or how you got into your current position. And then we'll dive into some deeper questions around DE&I. So actually, Ashley Duncan, if you don't mind kicking us off, could you tell us more about your current role and then how you got to where you are today?
Sure. Thank you, Joe. And thank you to everyone who is not only here, but also participating on the panel. I'm really thrilled to go home and tell my husband that I have been called distinguished twice today. So thank you for that. But I'm currently the Vice President and the Director of Inclusion and Diversity at Republic Bank. And my last 4 positions have been inaugural positions of the same type. So prior to that, I worked at JCPS, Jefferson County Public Schools here in Louisville, Kentucky, as the inaugural diversity hiring specialist, and at TARC, Transit Authority of River City, as the inaugural diversity director, diversity and inclusion director. You know, so Joe, to answer your question, I think my journey started a lot younger when I was advocating for friends of mine that were physically disabled and differently abled in middle school to get the same access and opportunity to just play outside and to do stuff with us and go on field trips. And so my advocacy for people who are different has always been a part of who I am in my DNA. But in terms of the journey that I've had professionally, you know, I started when I worked at TARC, I started when I was 14 years old at the Transit Authority. And much of the work there started as the ombudsman. and working through responding to EEOC complaints and helping to support the structures that they have in place is how my relationship with some of the work started. But then the Federal Transit Administration at the time came pretty far ahead of many organizations in their formality of putting requirements around some of the work that we're doing. And they said, we need to have a focus on this work at an executive level in every organization, and the person needs to be compensated at the same capacity as other executives. And so really that's where that relationship started. Much of the work at that time was heavily focused on compliance. And so different programs, federal programs that the Transit Authority had to respond to, Title VI, Title VII, and putting some of those structures in place is how I accomplished work there. Currently, years later at Republic Bank, my work is heavily focused on what we, and you mentioned earlier, of the umbrella of diversity and inclusion, or as we call it here at Republic Bank, inclusion and diversity. And so building the program literally from the ground up. We've had some structures in place and some initiatives take off prior to me coming, but really putting business resource groups in place, helping to support the employee life cycle and onboarding, and some of what we're going to talk about today, the recruitment cycle, hiring, promotion, the equitable outcomes that we're looking at, and how we can support associates or team members, employees, as we call them. Supplier diversity also is really big, but then also training, education, and different structures around how we can make sure that we're having conversations about what it means to be inclusive, what it means to be diverse, and obviously what the foundation for me is that equitable lens is necessary as well. So building policies and procedures is, I think, really where that rubber meets the road and where you get that meat and potatoes. So hopefully that was helpful.
Oh, definitely. And thank you for that, distinguished guest, just to give you a third one to mention. And Kelly, could you take it next?
Sure. Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Kelly Stallard Watson. I am currently the Equity and Compliance Officer at Louisville Metropolitan Sewer District. I was thinking about what I was going to say when you asked that question. So I think that I am an attorney. And so how I initially got started in this, I can say, as far as Ashley, equity, affirmative action, compliance had been something that I'd been interested in since I was in high school, growing up and participating in the local NAACP chapter, as well as the state and national NAACP offices, because I held those offices all throughout high school and college. And one of the reasons why I ended up wanting to be a lawyer and attending law school. After law school, I did a couple of one-offs. We'll just call them that because they don't fit in with everything else. I did municipal bonds as bond counsel. And later after that, I was a public defender. So, two opposite extremes, right? But part of the experience that I am glad that I really was able to do. Shortly thereafter that, I started working for the city of Louisville prior to merger, and I was the city's affirmative action officer. So very heavily compliant on EEO, on Title VII, Title VI, ADA. I wrote the city's ADA 504 plan, the city's affirmative action plan, and I was also involved in the certification and monitoring of the city's minority, female, and disabled business goals at that time. Right after merger, I became the director of the Human Relations Commission. So that's the office, of course, locally that enforces discrimination complaints in employment, housing, public accommodation, and hate crimes. The office also did the certification of the minority, women, and handicap-owned businesses, as well as the tracking and the monitoring of such. Left there, and under Steve Beshear, under his first term, I was the director of personnel management and also the director of the Office for Civil Rights and Small Business. And did that just for his first term, came back to Louisville, under Mayor Greg Fisher. And there I was the Director of Human Resources and the Labor Liaison. And also, once again, the quote unquote affirmative action officer. Each term he had, I changed positions. And so the second one, I was then general counsel. And thirdly, I was the first chief equity officer for Louisville Metro government, where we created our program internally and externally before I left there, and were really able to put things in place as far as training for Metro Council members and for Metro employees. We trained all 5,000 Metro employees in a little under a year. We were able to develop the organizational structure that embedded equity and an equity lens on policy and procedure within each of the departments, creating the city's first equity action plan, along with the departments and their equity action plans. I'm now at MSD doing the same thing, putting our structure together, training employees, as well as creating our equity action plan and our equity toolkit. And I also do compliance. So I am over employee relations and employee investigations that handle Title VII. I am also the external liaison for our Title VI complaints. And so very busy because we've now added 2 new counties to the district. And so we are now in the process of bringing on board new employees in Oldham County as well as in Bullitt. So thank you very much. And I'm glad to be here with you all today.
Thank you. And next up in our panel of 4, we have Kristen Smith, who I've yet to have the pleasure of meeting in person. Kristen.
Well, I'm tickled to death to be here with y'all and truly on a panel of very distinguished folks. I'm excited to learn with y'all today. I am based in Corbin, Kentucky. I own the Wrigley Tap Room and Eatery. I'm the chef, executive chef and owner, and also the owner and operator of Faulkner Bent Farm. My journey probably started when I took employment with a really fantastic company and then a really terrible company, and realized if one day I was ever an employer, I know kind of the direction I wanted to head. And lo and behold, I worked hard to be able to own my own restaurant. And I think I wanted to make sure that I did things with the mindset of inclusion and equity. And really at the time that I was creating that, I didn't even fully understand those terms. But writing procedures and policy, and working through that and educating myself as much as possible. I think I come from an area that's typically stereotyped, and I wanted to challenge those stereotypes and change them. And so for us at the Wrigley, we are a the core of hospitality, but what does hospitality look like for us when we have a table open to all? And that's, our customers and our employees. And so anyways, we're trudging along here with inspired plates and nurturing our community.
Awesome. And Kristen, if you don't mind, with your business journey, specifically thinking about Wrigley's Tap Room, it's my understanding that, in the area, this is a beacon of comfort and safety, specifically thinking about our LGBTQ plus population and maybe even our ethnic racial minorities as far as diversity in the area coming together in community. And I didn't know if you could expand on that a little bit more in thinking about, our panel today when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion.
I will absolutely do that with your questions in mind. It's a little nerve-wracking. I myself is in the LGBT community, and so It was a slow journey, to test the water. But we've gotten so much further than I thought we would ever be, honestly, 8 years ago when I developed our restaurant plan. And I think, honestly, sometimes that's just short-mindedness for our community. Yeah, I'll keep that in mind. I will be talking with those thoughts of our LGBT community.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. And then last but not least, as far as our 4 panelists go today, we have Dr. Philip Rumrill. And if you're here, doctor, if you don't mind.
Yes, please. Thank you. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Stephanie, thanks for your leadership in putting this together. And Joe, thanks for facilitating this panel. Ashley, excuse me, mentioned that she wants to tell her husband about her participation on this distinguished panel. And there's 2 people I'd like to tell. Excuse me, I have somehow lost my voice just this morning. I don't know if it's fear of public speaking or something like that, but bear with me as I try to go through my lungs here. But Joe, the first would be my late grandfather, who was a tremendous boxing fan his entire life. And he would be, I'm sure you heard this before, but he would be delighted to know that I'm on a panel, distinguished or otherwise, that is facilitated by Joe Frazier. So I would like him to know that. And I would also like to tell my father-in-law that I'm on a distinguished panel, because he'd have a hard time believing that, because he still thinks I'm a loser. So, but that's his problem. Today, I'm distinguished, and I'm delighted to be here. I am a professor of counselor education and director of research and training at the Human Development Institute at the University of Kentucky, HDI. HDI is Kentucky's University Center on Disability, and we run funded projects related to the role and participation of people with disabilities in all aspects of society across the lifespan, and people dealing with multiple identities. In terms of how I got to where I am today, I'm not sure I've gotten anywhere. They say that all you keep is the getting there, and I am still very much on my journey, so that's still unfolding. But I became blind when I was 16 years old due to a rare neurological condition, and didn't have any connection to the disability community or anything else really at that particular time. And from that point on, I was connected with professionals who provide rehabilitation, counseling services, vocational rehabilitation services, et cetera. And I became so interested in the enterprise of supports for people with disabilities through my own experiences that I became interested in developing my own career out of it. And so since really my entire career has been devoted to developing educational programs, vocational interventions, and training professionals to provide services to people with disabilities, again, of all ages and from all backgrounds, and excuse me, across the lifespan. So I'm a proud and grateful beneficiary of all the diversity, equity, and inclusion work that you all do, of the Americans with Disabilities Act and other civil rights protections, without accommodations in my current job, I wouldn't be able to perform my job. There's no question about that. Of the state vocational rehabilitation program, and of the growing societal commitment to inclusion and diversity, really in all its forms. And that's what really excites me about being here today. In addition to taking part in a field that has such personal and professional meaning to me, excuse me, the opportunity to cast disability within the broader context of diversity and human variation is really a great honor for me and for all my colleagues at HDI. And we're just delighted to take part in this panel. So I want to thank my colleagues for this opportunity, and really looking forward to the rest of our time together.
Thank you, yeah, for sharing, and so that's our panelists, everyone, and so I think one of the first directions I'd like to take this conversation after following up with all these great introductions, first is acknowledging that each one of our panelists are trailblazers in their profession, so in establishing businesses or coming into new companies. I operate from this perspective of with a lot of these kind of positions and areas, if there wasn't a problem, these positions wouldn't necessarily exist. And a lot of times when folks are coming into these roles, it's to create space, right? To create equity, to give access, and even just to bring awareness to different populations and the unique needs and experiences that come with those that if you don't happen to share one of these identities in some form, you wouldn't necessarily know about the plights or just difference in experience that comes with having certain identities. And so with that in mind, and I'll go in reverse order with our panelists, could you all share some examples or what you all feel are some of the largest barriers to employment or the workforce in general when it comes to the respective populations that you all work with? And I'm gonna take it back to you, Dr. Rumwell.
Thanks, Joe. I'm just having a slight delay when I unmute, so I'm not trying to pause on you. I'm just trying to get on. You can hear me now?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
And no problem at all.
Sure. Well, we find there are a number of barriers that are really durable and seem to prevent people with disabilities from participating in employment at the same rates as the general population. Currently, the labor force participation rate for working age adults with significant disabilities in America is about 21%. It's about 72% for working age adults in the general population. So we find people with disabilities 3.5 times less likely to be employed than similarly aged people without disabilities. This statistic has been pretty durable since World War II, and doesn't seem to change for any number of reasons. Some are low expectations. Societally, we often don't expect people with disabilities to participate in the labor force and in fact excuse them from doing so. And this goes back to low expectations on the part of teachers and parents and what have you. We also can't deny the functional limitations associated with disability, which do narrow the range of options. I could, for example, very much want to be a truck driver and have a strong interest in doing that. I might live somewhere where there's a lot of jobs in that area. That's not something I'm able to do. And so it may have a narrowing of the band of options that are due to disability. That's another. Responses in the workplace by coworkers, workplace discrimination. We've studied this phenomenon very carefully, and since the ADA that took full effect in 1994, the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission has received and adjudicated about 1.1 million allegations of workplace discrimination against people with disabilities, filed against employers, I should say, and those proportions each year of complaints have gone up since the ADA Amendments Act took effect in January of 2009. So a lack of understanding of disability in the workplace, and on this panel and the people tuning in on this particular call, access and inclusion-minded folks who embrace the ideals of diversity, that's not the problem, but we still have significant inroads in terms of disability awareness and linking disability within these broader diversity, equity, and inclusion contexts. The provision of assistive technology or not, other workplace accommodations if they're available, transportation to and from work, social support, and personal care on the job. These are some of the other barriers that we continue to face as we're wanting to make sure people with disabilities have access to all the same opportunities as anybody else. Those are just a few I'd point to, and I'll be quiet because I want to hear from my colleagues more than I want to hear from myself. Thank you.
No, I appreciate that answer. Thank you. Kristen.
Barriers. Wow. I don't know if we have enough time,
I was gonna
but
say, how much time do we have?
yeah, it feels like there's only a handful of sectors that are welcoming to the queer community for the most part. I mean, right off the top of my head, I mean, barriers for I mean, childcare and um transportation is the minimal, right, for a lot of folks in our area. But then with the queer community, I think um it's there's, you know, restaurants are pretty open because it's hard work, you know. But we're talking about like the education system in our area, in our region. I'd say folks need to keep their personal life to themselves. I do have slowly slowly but surely conversations with superintendents, you know. I um and there's definitely some more openness happening. But unfortunately, you know, um, I think our school systems predominantly, you know, employ a lot of folks in our areas, in the rural areas. Hospitals, I have seen, are definitely becoming more open and inclusive. And that's extremely hopeful. I would say the education system is way behind and in a lot of ways, right? But if you just even look different, right, you won't even get an interview. I think there's you know, and we can go into a few more strategic ways maybe in your other questions, Joe, but I think the way we handle our application and interview process really, even at that foundational level, can change a lot of things. Um, you know, not including pictures, you know, or asking questions that really does not matter. But anyway, just to be simple, you know, simple about it. I don't know if, you know, that answers fully. I mean, again, I can go down all kinds of rabbit holes, but the infrastructure, I mean, especially in our neck of the woods, there's not a whole lot of opportunities of employment. We're working on that, but you know, yeah, we'll jump into some of the more innuendos in a few minutes. I'll
Yeah.
leave time for Kelly and Ashley.
Well, I really appreciate that response too, because it also makes me think about, you know, I guess a subtopic under diversity, equity, and inclusion, and thinking about visible identities versus invisible identities, right? So we have some identities that folks can see it. They can tell, you know, for example, I'm Black. I don't think anyone's going to question that. And then that comes with its own barriers or difference in treatment and biases that can come with it, right? I think that most folks would say I'm a male, you know, male, Black male, that sort of thing. But then when we think about sexual orientation or being a member of the queer community, and even aspects of how we think about our community with disabilities, right? Where, you know, people might often think disability and think of physical ones, but we also have our mental ones and things like that too. And it's interesting thinking about in employment for folks with underserved or marginalized, invisible identities, what their experience is like in the workplace. And, you know, things can seem all good when you first start, but with this new trend and being your authentic self in the workplace for folks who have invisible identities, can those identities really be their authentic selves in their work environment? And what does that look like? So, you know, we'll get back to that too, but just going off of your comments is something that spurred in my mind, that I'm not sure that folks often think about the differences and nuances that come with invisible versus visible identities. So thank you.
That's right. Yeah, both my wife and I have both been fired from positions when we introduced our partners to other coworkers. So yeah, that happens, and that's why that's why I'm not that way as an employer.
No, thank you. Kelly?
Thank you for this conversation. I mean, I think initially, when I was thinking about barriers, there are built into employment and into workforce, and are the systematic and institutional barriers that created the system that from the very beginning have left certain groups behind, right? And that has changed over time. And so we're still working, a lot of us, within that framework. And so when you think about barriers, they're the regular barriers that you'll see around institutional and systematic racism. I think Kristen mentioned, transportation. That's always a barrier. Childcare is a barrier. Education requirements is a barrier. Being that targeted recruitment that's necessary to identify individuals that are within positions to really be open and have access to the workforce is also important. And then when you think about your own organizations, right, your own unconscious and an implicit bias is a barrier. And so how do you look to remove those barriers and close the gap so that everyone has an equal access and an equal opportunity to jobs? One of the things that I did when I was at Louisville Metro Government, we were piloting de-identifying applications and resumes when they came in for positions. And so what that means is we would remove not just any demographic or gender specific information, but also even geographic information. And where, if you're in Louisville, the question of the day is always, where did you go to high school? And, people can tell things by your address. And so we were removing addresses, anything, organizations that they may have been a part of, as well as anything that would, and you just had qualifications in front of you. And what we began to see in the couple of departments that we were piloting from is that when you're looking at qualifications, the people that were getting interviews were people that probably wouldn't have gotten an interview before. And sometimes that's because you've got hiring managers that want to hire their buddy and they already know who they're looking for. And sometimes it's just unconsciously things that people are looking for and don't even necessarily know that they are being biased in that way. So I would say that it's really important to train not your hiring managers on their implicit bias and unconscious bias, and really begin to look at that sort of targeted recruitment that's necessary and try to break down those barriers. And you can do that through mentorship apprentice programs, things of that nature as well, to help people feel comfortable once they're in the environment. It's not just about recruiting, it's about the retaining and what they're looking like when they're there, and really being able to feel comfortable in that. And as an organization, knowing what your culture is to be able to bring the best out in your workforce. So I'll stop there because that's quite a bit, but thank you.
No, thank you, Kelly. And Ashley, yes, if you'd like to add.
Yeah, I'll try my best to use brevity, but this is such a broad question. And I think, one hearing my answer would think that Kelly and I worked together on our answers, but we did not. But I think she teed me off really well. So thank you for that, Kelly. So I want to spend some time and really just share a barrier that I think that we've heard a lot about in the past, I say 18 to 24 months. It does not get enough credit because of its power and its influence in the way that we manage our life. And I remember being in college, having a class on perceptions, and our professor said, write down every single thing you do from the time you wake up until the time you get to work. And we are so driven by autopilot, we don't really understand the impact of implicit bias and implicit nature of our day and the things that are just driven into our being. And so I will say, just to underscore and really elevate some of the things that Kelly talked about, one of the most important things that we see in the workplace and don't see, frankly, that really has a lot to do with some of the things that she called out, which come from systemic barriers, institutional barriers, are rooted in bias. And we hear the term implicit bias, but there are so many different things so many different types of bias that are coupled into or under the umbrella. And so I'll share one of the things I recently put in place in support with human resources here at Republic Bank was diverse hiring panels. And it's like, well, what does that have to do with anything, right? The reality is that having people across the table, across the phone, on the opposite side of whatever tool you're interviewing or talking to someone with has a lot to do with how you are going to navigate that conversation. Cultural differences, gender orientation, physical differences, someone calling your headwear the difference between a yarmulke and a kufi could make a huge difference in how you navigate the space of inclusion when you decide to go work for that particular organization. And so thinking about having people who can speak to, not just educating them on what implicit bias is, and I'll just share a few examples that we've put into our program. So we have confirmation bias, right? Seeks to find evidence that confirms if this person really did go to the same high school I went to, or I thought that was them. And having a halo bias or the horn effect, and just confirming if you don't like someone automatically, how you can find ways implicitly to help get you to that point of deciding, I don't know if Ashley's the person we want, and they don't really fit into the culture here at this organization. So when I think about bias, to me, educating associates, and I say associates, that's what we call our employees. So educating employees on the power of bias is a huge opportunity to reduce barriers. We will never eliminate all the barriers. I think I heard a number that said our brains are trying to manage 1 million different ideas, but we can only process 11 of those every second or something like that, right? How amazing is that? Like, I'm thinking about my lunch right now, I'm thinking about my family, but I'm also trying to be fully engaged and active in this dialogue. And that's difficult to do if you're managing a conversation about someone coming to your organization as an employee. So coupling that with what Kristen shared, Dr. Romwell shared, but also understanding the importance of education of those barriers is really key. I wanted to just really quickly say 2 things as well. Joe started off by saying, obviously, I'm a Black man, and that's really important. So friends, when we hear people say, I don't see color, I just see you as who you are. That's a bias, right? And what you're saying to me is I am not visible. You don't see me in my fullness of who I am and how I show up. And that is not allowing the panelists or the candidate to show up as their authentic self. So if you say that, or if you hear that, I really want to encourage our audience members to call that out and think through what that means. People are showing up as their full authentic self. So don't say to people, I don't see color, or I see people just as, that we're all the same, and we're not. And our individualities make us powerful. And I'm just really in love with Kristen's hat. And I'm like, if I was in person, I would try to take that hat and run with it. But, that makes us beautiful. And then the other thing that Dr. Romwell talked about earlier is, his visible disability. And for me, one of the things that, or his blindness, I should say, with respect to, his disability, I want to say that one of the things I'm really looking forward to is data that really shows how many people that have visible disabilities are getting jobs as a result of this platform, right? March of 2020 will go down in the history books as a time that many of us will never forget. But that also, I remember that happening, and I just could not have been happier to think so many people who would have not had an opportunity to get hired before will now get a job because of the ability for people to see them only in their face on the screen and only see their qualifications. And that makes me happy. But that also makes me really discouraged to think about when we transition back, how we can address what that looks like. So friends, I'll say what I started with is educate yourselves, educate your team on the importance, the power, and the barriers that implicit bias really create for the work that we do in trying to elevate and expand inclusion and diversity.
I'll
Thank you.
mention one more. I'll mention one more barrier that we experience a lot from Appalachia is our accents. It took me a long time to be proud of where I'm from and my own accent, and trying to knock it out of me. But my mother taught me early on, when you talk to anyone outside the region, to code switch real quick, or they won't respect you. They won't give you your time. They'll assume that you have no shoes on your feet. And so, that's something we're reclaiming here in Appalachia and changing. And it's a bias that a lot of people don't really talk about as well, but it's very real.
Definitely. And that code switching conversation is something we could end up spending a lot of time on, and what that looks like in our different experiences, and, what does it mean to sound professional, and who all does that leave behind? And one of the things I also wanted to piggyback on with Ashley's comments too around that implicit bias piece is, again, right, this extends beyond just hiring, but also thinking about retention of our employees from different backgrounds and populations, and what does that workforce climate look like? And well, why aren't certain folks really staying that long at this company? Maybe it's what do those implicit biases look like in their day-to-day interactions? One of the things that come to mind is at a previous employer that I had, when it came to Black male directors or hire, there were 3 of us. But we always got confused as the same 3 people on a regular basis, right? Like after working for somewhere for 4 years, and either I'm DJ or I'm Joe, or I forgot our third person, Isaiah. So it would be the 3 of us interchangeably, right? And recognizing who we were. At a different employer, I remember my first day making some purchases for the center that I was hired over, and then getting approached by the person over the director over purchasing, and was asked like, I see what all you're buying, and I just want to make sure that you understand that any funds, from the organization have to be used professionally and not, personally, or, for your home use. And it's like, I know that. I'm well aware, right? Like you don't make it this high and work across different organizations thinking that you can spend company funds on personal items for your house. And this was a person that I still get along with to this day. But just those initial biases that folks don't even know they're acting on start coming out on a daily basis, right? And it affects how valued do you feel at this employer or institution. Starts making you question, well, so does everyone here think I'm these other 2 people, or that I'm out here doing crazy stuff personally that's actually for the company? And it sticks with you. So I really appreciate those comments, and just want to solidify how those, can even play out after employment, and just whether it's a positive environment or not.
Joe, it looks like Phil is trying to break in here, so just want to give him the floor if
Okay.
we can.
Please, yes, Phil.
So I was waiting for Joe to finish. I did have something I wanted to say. I was also just clearing my throat also, so bear with me. Joe, I really appreciate you drawing this distinction between hiring and retention. And I think this cuts across other elements of diversity, not just disability, and none of us views our own, populations and constituencies within a silo for sure. We're here because we're looking at this in terms of multiple identities. But I think you can hire a fairly diverse workforce simply by not discriminating against people, by treating people fairly, okay? But you don't keep people by just not treating them badly, right? You have to make them feel appreciated and valued. And it's those identities and characteristics that make us all diverse and different. And Ashley, I love your point about, and Joe, you alluded to this too. It's not about us all being the same and having the same approach all the way around. It's about understanding how we're different, and that those differences, when you put them all together, make any organization better. And I think we are getting there as a society slowly. And this notion in my field of rehabilitation, we talk about the concept of total workplace inclusion, and it's not, you don't stop at complying with the law. You make people feel that the things they're bringing into that environment are value added based on their characteristics. The characteristic isn't something you tolerate, right, or we overlook. It's something we embrace because it makes everything that happens considered on a broader perspective. It makes things work better. No society, culture, or political system that is totally monolithic or homogeneous has ever succeeded over time. No organization is going to do that either. Business is better when we are able to actualize these ideals that we can get most people to agree with. And I think the retention, the keeping good workers, and in this national labor shortage, when has that ever been more important? Hiring and retention. But you want to keep people as long as you can. But it doesn't seem like rocket science to me. You have to make them feel appreciated. And what should we be appreciating other than the unique things that they that they bring to the table? So getting from hey, I'm okay with your identity, right? I mean, that's maybe a B- or C+ answer. We're not going to treat you badly on the basis of it, but how about this is going to add something we don't have? And organizations that really do make people feel that way, guess what? They're more productive. They have better retention, and they have a more diverse and more productive workforce. It's kind of like I don't mean to be hyperbolic, but it ain't that complicated,
Yeah, absolutely, Phil. And then that also really just leads into a question we have in the chat from Steve Rudolph with the Great Resignation and increasing war for talent, what, if any, changes do you all see in barriers coming down for companies that are more open to reaching out to those who have been historically, excluded from the workforce?
I'll jump in there and say, and I'm sure this is not going to be the popular answer, right? But over the last year or so, right, there's been a lot of companies. Everybody has a commitment to equity, a commitment to diversity, a commitment to inclusion. But, in reflection right about now, there's been some change, but not enough, and not what they said they were going to do. And so part of that is what you're seeing with this Great Resignation, right? Is you've got companies and employers that have come out and said, we're going to do this and we're do this and we're supportive of this, but they really have not done anything within their culture to support that and say that. And you'll see people who honestly don't have to put up with it, don't want to anymore, and can really at a place now where talent is being heavily recruited, move on to a place where they will feel that. And I think part of it is if they had done, right, what they said they were going to do and what their commitment is and what people have told shareholders and stockholders, you would see a difference. It's not like what you think it would be. Not that there haven't been some improvements, but the acknowledgement and the actions don't always match right now.
Thank you. Yeah. And are there other thoughts from our panelists on that question too? Thinking about changes you see and barriers coming down and companies being more open to reaching out to those who historically been underserved?
Yeah, I'll share that, I'm a big believer in policy change. Having conversations is great. Talking about it, educating people on different factors that impact the work that we do is phenomenal. But policy change is really where you start to see some of that systemic and implicit dynamic of the work that we see in the structures really shift. So what I strongly recommend is having policy changes around what that means for the workforce. And I don't want to call the company out because I don't have permission at all, but there's a company here in Louisville, a global company here in Louisville. Their CEO put his stake in the sand and said, if you do not have a diverse panel of applicants, don't bring me the list. I don't care who it is. And so making that a policy, but also a practice, is important. But starting at the top with those types of dialogues makes a difference, because I can just say, well, we tried to reach out to Kentucky State University and we have a relationship with Simmons College and we did all these things, but nothing happened. So I'm going to hire my friend from Trinity and St. X anyway, right? That's not good enough. And so us really making sure that we have those difficult conversations and changing policy is what's going to make a difference. Are we actually looking at our data, our hiring data, actually our entire life cycle, employee life cycle, and saying, are we making inroads? Are we having conversations with people, as Dr. Rumfield said, before they decide to leave? We get them here. It's like that joke that people talk about, the difference between heaven and hell, and then you choose hell not knowing that, it's not as pretty, but when you get there, it's like, we put our best foot forward for you, but when I get here, it's a horrible environment. We don't want that. So we want to make sure that we're creating a space for people to really, truly have an authentic experience, but then also, frankly, accountability is where we're going to start to see some changes. So if you pair policy changes with accountability, I have seen some great shifts in the work, because accountability, especially for companies that offer bonuses, offer pay increases tied to performance metrics. If you tie DE&I work to accountability, people will take it serious. Their skin is now in the game. People like Kelly and Kristen, we are not carrying that load ourselves, right? I can't be the CEO, right? The chief everything officer for everything supplier diversity. I have to do more, but I have to lock arms with people like Ryan, who I'm seeing on the call, and Rosalind and Juliet. Like, I need to lock arms with you and have the conversation about how we can work together and implement the policy, but then also hold ourselves accountable to make sure that when we see the Great Resignation happen, what are we doing in the middle to avoid those resignations? How are we supporting our environment to create a space that really cultivates inclusion, authentic inclusion and belonging for employees?
And
I'm really struck by your point that, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. I'm
Go
sorry.
ahead. No, you first.
Okay, thank you. I was just going to say, when you're really trying to make those policy changes, that is where the rubber meets the road. That's the barrier. Like, that is the pushback, right? And so how do you go about systematically trying to do that? It's wonderful when you have the top leadership saying, this is what we're going to do and this is how we're going to do it. But we all know that your work environment is who you report to, right? It's your supervisor. It's that direct person that you report to that's signing off on your timesheet, that's doing your performance evaluation. And so you really have to think about, I always say, particularly with this work, right? We have to be storytellers, right? And make sure that we're telling a very good story and the why this is important, the value that we're going to get from it personally and professionally and for the organization. And so hopefully that will drive people, but if not, you really do have to tie it to measures, because we all know what gets measured is what people will pay attention to. But that still sometimes doesn't fix your culture. You're still going to have issue because you're making people do it. That should always, in my opinion, be the last thing that you do, right? But if you're really going for a culture change and being very intentional and deliberate, you have a very intentional, deliberate process to bring people along with you as you change those policies, as they start to see different faces and different people at work, and they know how to act when they see that, and they're not being offensive, and there's not microaggressions that people are experiencing every day, but you know how to fix it. And so it's a journey. And so it's not going to happen overnight, and you're going to lose people along the way, but you also hopefully will bring people along the way as well.
Thank you.
I'm struck by this I have this sort of physical and spatial thought about this, and it starts at the top for sure, but it has to go organizationally. It has to go all the way to the bottom and then back up again. I'm thinking about my boss, Dr. Kathy Shepard-Jones, the executive director of HDI. She sits on the University of Kentucky's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion committee. Okay, and she has plenty of other things to do. Could delegate that responsibility for sure. But this is so important that we are a part of all of the DEI conversations. that she has a seat at the table there. We're now hiring a diversity, equity, and inclusion coordinator for our own institute who will oversee all inclusion efforts within our inclusion institute to make sure that we are applying the broadest possible perspective on diversity to everything that we do in our disability institute. And Dr. Shepherd-Jones had the foresight to list personal and lived experience with disability and with other multiple identities as a preferred qualification for the job, okay? So we believe that in this position, leading the DEI initiative within our organization, the person who has that experience with some element of diversity in his or her own life is a better candidate than somebody who does not. And that's very different than de-identifying applications and saying, oh, we can't look at this, we don't want to consider it. And I guess my point is when a diverse identity or characteristic really is value added to the organization, and the organizations that are really looking for those qualities, if you are, then say so. And don't just say, we're going to affirmatively, reach out, we're going to recruit, we're going to do this. But if you have these qualifications, in certain instances, this makes you a better candidate than somebody who doesn't. And that's coming away off of the, compliance versus climate change, kind of idea. But that's how important we view this and how we view diversity really in a non-hierarchical sense. One characteristic isn't necessarily any more important than another when we think about diversity, but it's the combination of everything that everybody brings that makes it interesting. And when you pervade that across all levels of the organization, then all of a sudden people do feel welcome, they do feel included, they do feel appreciated, they do feel valued because their characteristics, skills, and experiences are what are being uplifted and valued. Not a bunch of people going around trying to figure out how we're going to treat you okay in spite of what you bring to the table, I'm sorry for rambling. This is just so exciting to have this conversation with all of you in this broad context. It's just an incredible opportunity, and I thank you all for it.
You are not rambling.
I'm going to
You're
be quiet.
Enthusiastic, and we appreciate it immensely.
Yeah, no need to apologize. I think that's the thing with these conversations. There's so much to discuss, and there's so many intricacies with each point that they're all worthy of their own session, webinar, workshop, whatever that may be. And acknowledging that we are pressed for time, right? Because we do end at 1. I did want to call attention to another question we had in the chat, which was how do we ensure that it won't turn into what is happening now in the NFL regarding hiring of head coaches. The policy was there, but it was not authentic. And I think this is in reference to one of the policies around ensuring that there's at least one diverse or minority candidate in each of the hiring searches moving forward. And there were still some issues where maybe there was already a coach in mind for the job, and it seemed to just be kind of a sham and having that practice. And I want to make sure I'm representing what actually happened correctly too. So if someone wants to add in some more context around that, please do. But I'll leave that open for the panelists.
Not being a panelist, but as a lawyer and unable to not throw my 2 cents into this discussion, I think it's what's happening. I think it's a lawsuit. I think when you talk about the ways in which policies can be effective, it's ensuring that they are enforced to the letter and not just for the visual. So I think things like this class action to really draw light to these conversations. Without that class action, we wouldn't know about this, and this wouldn't be a topic of conversation. So I think, while the HR professionals on this call, their hair may stand up on end when we say that lawyers may be a solution to some bad policies that exist in the universe, but I do think that there is a real place for advocacy in this conversation.
That's what I was going to say. You can have a policy, and in this case, what you've got is a pattern and practice suit where they basically were still discriminating, right? The impact of what they were trying to do still was a disparate impact on the people that they stated in the policy they were trying to assist. Sometimes you got to use, a lawsuit, like I said, Stephanie, I'm a lawyer, so lawsuits don't scare me, because people they're going to bring those regardless, whether they have, they're able, they're substantiated or not. But the thing is that when you have a policy of this nature, it's important that you do the monitoring and the tracking, right? And the advocacy needs to come from the inside and the outside, right? Like, I'm going to make you accountable. You're going to be transparent with what you're trying to do as well. And so if you publicly saying, oh, we're going to make sure that we're interviewing diverse candidates, and then you've got years where there are no diverse candidates, then obviously your policy is ineffective and you're still operating in a discriminatory manner. And so you'll need people such as we've got him, for lack of a better word, we can call him a whistleblower. You've got someone who has brought, attention to it and is basically saying, I know the ramifications are what's going to happen to me, but I'm going to do this anyway. And that's important, that inside, outside, that flashlight, right? Put the sun on it and let people see. We are transparent about all kinds of other things that we do within our organizations. This should be, we need to be just as transparent.
That's great. Thank you for that, Kelly.
I've heard it said that you can't legislate morality, but of course you can, and we have to, and we'll continue to do it until, as long as we do have to. And it's one thing to have the policy and to enforce it, and to the enforcement of the policy makes more likely that people will comply with the policy. And over the course of a generation of implementing it, maybe it becomes authentic in the way we want it. Maybe the climate and culture change happens after that. But unfortunately, we've had to start most meaningful diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives with some formalized requirement. If we didn't, well, we know what the consequences. We know what would happen. We were living it, and change is still slow. So it's really important to make sure that it can't just be done in an informal and organic way. There has to be some guidance for sure, and everyone on the panel knows more about that part than I do. But it just seems that this is just a really important part of the discussion as well. And it's the top-down idea. It's policy to practice, but we're ending up with the same goal, and that is a cultural and climate change within the workplace where diversity is, in all of its forms, is appreciated and valued and not just tolerated.
Thank you. Yes, and it pains me because it's 1:03, and I do want to be respectful of our panelists' schedules and everyone else that's here today. But there's just so much more, to all of this, and to talk to, and to talk about, and we're really still scratching the surface when it comes into these initiatives. But I want to thank everyone for your time today, for being able to make it out to this month's partner spotlight, and again, just thank you to our panelists for keeping it real about DE&I. It's a tough field to work in, and again, thank you for all of the work that you all are doing as trailblazers in your communities and your organizations, in opening those doors up to be more inclusive places. So thank you again. And I appreciate everyone for making time to come out today.
Yes, absolutely. We really do appreciate your expertise and your time. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today.
What an honor to be with you. Thank you.
Thanks, Phil. Y'all
And
take
we all-
care.
Let's have more of these discussions.
You got it. That's what I'm hearing
Look
today,
forward
is
to
to be continued for sure.
Thank you all. This is just the start. Wow, amazing. Thank you.